The grand dining room of Ashford Hall was a masterpiece of winter luxury. 3 enormous crystal chandeliers threw warm, fractured light across the mahogany tables, illuminating the silver cutlery, the imported holly centerpieces, and the diamonds resting against the collarbones of the county's elite. It was Christmas Eve, and the air was thick with the scent of roasted chestnuts, expensive perfumes, and the quiet, effortless hum of generational wealth. But for Rosalind Thorne, the heat in the room was suffocating. She sat at the far end of the hall, not just at the end of the main table, but entirely separated from it. She had been seated at the secondary table, the small, unadorned station designated for the head butler, the housekeeper, and the senior footman. Rosalind wore a plain, dark green dress. It was well made, but horribly out of place among the sea of silk, velvet, and tailored evening coats. Her hands were folded in her lap, hidden beneath the edge of the tablecloth. Her fingers, trembling with a violent and visible energy, gripped a tarnished silver key. It was the only thing she had left of her late father's estate. The cold metal dug into her palm, leaving deep crescent moon indentations in her skin. She welcomed the physical pain. It anchored her, keeping her from shattering right there in the chair. Just 20 feet away, at the center of the main table, sat Arthur Ashford, the 6th Duke of Ashford. He was impeccable in a structured black evening coat, his ash-blonde hair catching the warm light, his aristocratic square jaw set in a rigid line. He was the man she had loved in secret for 5 years. He was the man who had whispered promises to her in the quiet shadows of the estate gardens, promising that her status as a ruined merchant's daughter wouldn't matter. Arthur turned his head. His deep-set gray eyes swept the room with the practiced authority of a host. For a fraction of a second, his gaze landed on Rosalind. In that microsecond, Rosalind saw it. The expensive, untouchable confidence of the Duke cracked. A flash of silent panic, of profound agony, rippled behind his eyes. He saw her sitting there, degraded, exiled to the kitchen staff's table in front of 200 guests. He saw the faint, singular mascara tear track that had dried on her pale cheek, a track she had absolutely refused to wipe away, wearing it like a battle scar. But then Arthur did the most devastating thing of all. He looked right through her. He blinked, turned his attention to the Earl of Waverley seated to his left, and offered a polite, hollow smile. He pretended he did not know her. He pretended she was invisible. A sudden clink of a silver spoon against a crystal glass cut through the ambient noise of the room. The conversations died down instantly. At the head of the table, Dowager Duchess Eleanor rose to her feet. She wore a gown of heavy emerald silk that seemed to absorb the light around it. Her angular face, defined by harsh, high cheekbones and icy blue eyes, radiated a sovereign, cruel authority. Rosalind's breathing turned shallow. Her gaze dropped from Arthur to the object resting casually on the Dowager's lap, a thick black leather ledger. That ledger was the reason Arthur had turned his face away. It was the reason Rosalind was sitting with the servants. 3 hours ago, in the privacy of the drawing room, the Dowager had presented that ledger to Arthur. It contained masterfully forged financial documents implicating Rosalind's late father in massive fraud against the crown. If the Dowager handed that ledger to the authorities, Rosalind would not just be ruined, she would be sentenced 20 years in a miserable, freezing prison cell. You will seat her with the staff tonight. The Dowager had told Arthur, her voice like cracking ice, and you will not look at her. You will not speak to her. If you defend her, if you show her 1 ounce of pity, this ledger goes to the magistrate before dessert is served. Do we understand each other? Arthur. Arthur had chosen her freedom over her dignity. He was playing blind to keep her alive. He thought he was saving her. Ladies and gentlemen. The Dowager's voice rang out, crisp and melodic, demanding absolute submission from the room. On this joyous Christmas Eve, it is my immense pleasure to welcome our dear friends to Ashford Hall. We are gathered not just to celebrate the season, but to celebrate the enduring strength of proper, well-bred alliances. The Dowager's icy blue eyes slid slowly across the room, bypassing the glittering lords and ladies, until they locked dead onto Rosalind at the servants' table. A predatory, Victoria's smile touched the older woman's lips. And we must also thank our extended household. The Dowager continued, her tone dripping with poisoned sweetness. Those who serve quietly in the background, knowing their exact place within the hierarchy of this great estate. Your compliance is deeply appreciated. A low murmur of uncomfortable laughter rippled through the main table. Several guests turned to look at the secondary table. Sir Edmund's daughters whispered behind their fans. The head housekeeper sitting next to Rosalind stared rigidly at her plate, her face flushed with second-hand shame. Rosalind's throat closed. The air in her lungs felt like glass shards. She looked at Arthur one last time. He was staring intensely at his untouched wine glass, the signet ring on his finger turning round and round under his thumb. His jaw clenched so hard a muscle ticked in his cheek. He was enduring this. He was waiting for the dinner to end so he could find her later and apologize in the dark. But Rosalind Thorne was not a woman who waited to be saved in the dark. She was not a victim to be managed, and she refused to let her survival be bought with her public humiliation. If one smile from him could get her killed socially and financially, then she no longer needed his smile. Slowly, with terrifying composure, Rosalind released her grip on the silver key. She uncurled her numb fingers. She picked up her heavy linen napkin, folded it with surgical precision into a perfect square, and placed it beside her untouched soup bowl. She stood up. The scrape of her wooden chair against the parquet floor was deafening in the quiet room. Hundreds of eyes darted toward her. Arthur's head snapped up, his grey eyes widening in sudden, raw terror. Rosalind did not lower her head. She did not flush. She did not cry. She kept her spine perfectly straight, her chin parallel to the floor. She did not look at the Dowager, and she did not look at Arthur. Without a single word, Rosalind turned her back on the glittering chandeliers, the roaring fires, and the man who had let her burn. Her footsteps echoed with a hollow, final sound as she walked out of the grand dining room, leaving a suffocating silence in her wake. The heavy oak doors of the grand dining room clicked shut behind her, instantly severing the warmth, the laughter, and the low, expensive hum of high society voices. The silence of the East Wing corridor swallowed Rosalind whole. She did not run. Running was a frantic, desperate thing, an action reserved for prey. And as she walked down the dim, stone-floored hallway, her spine perfectly straight, Rosalind decided with absolute clarity that she would never be hunted again. Her dark green dress, simple and unadorned, felt heavy and restrictive against her skin. Her hands remained at her sides, her fingers still numb and curled tightly around the tarnished silver key. The metal was biting into her palm, the sharp edges pressing deep enough to leave a permanent mark, but she welcomed the dull ache. It was the only real thing in a house built entirely on polite, devastating lies. Instead of taking the grand staircase, Rosalind navigated the narrow, unlit servant corridors. The air grew progressively colder as she moved further away from the roaring hearths of the elite. She reached the heavy iron, wrought door that led out to the kitchen courtyard, and pushed it open with both hands. But the winter storm hit her like a physical blow. It was snowing heavily, the wind howling through the courtyard and driving the freezing flakes sideways. Rosalind stepped out onto the wet cobblestones, the thin soles of her shoes immediately soaking through. The biting cold slashed across her exposed shoulders, but she did not shiver. She stood perfectly still beneath the faint amber glow of a single courtyard lantern, letting the freezing wind rip the last remnants of the dining room's suffocating heat from her lungs. Slowly she raised her free hand. Her trembling fingertips brushed against her pale cheek, tracing the singular, dried mascara tear track that she had refused to wipe away inside. It was stiff against her skin. It was the only tear she had allowed herself to shed for Arthur Ashford. It would be the last. She opened her right hand and stared down at the tarnished silver key resting in her palm. It was heavy, old, and completely useless within the walls of Ashford Hall. Looking at it, the memory hit her with the sharp, sudden clarity of shattered glass. Her father, a merchant who had built an empire only to be systematically ruined by the very aristocrats he trusted, had pressed this exact key into her hand on his deathbed. His breathing had been ragged, his hands cold. "They will take the money, Rose," he had whispered, his eyes burning with a fierce, dying light. "But this opens the vault in the financial district. The one under my mother's maiden name. They don't know about it. Promise me you won't use it until you understand the rules of their game." She had been too young to understand the rules then. She understood them perfectly now. Rosalind closed her eyes, letting the snow catch in her dark brown hair. She was not naive. She knew exactly what was inside the Dowager Duchess's black leather ledger. Forged transfer deeds, fabricated letters, a meticulously crafted trail of financial treason that would officially hang her father's legacy and throw Rosalind into a freezing, miserable prison cell for 20 years. Arthur's silence at the table hadn't been born of malice. It had been born of a calculated, desperate strategy. He was sacrificing her public dignity to guarantee her legal safety. He was playing the board. He thought he was saving her. But practicality without honor was just a different breed of cruelty. If his love required her to sit silently in exile while the people who had bled her family dry laughed at her expense, then his love was a worthless currency. He was a coward dressed up as a responsible man. She knew exactly what would happen if she stayed. She would sit in her drafty room, and hours later, when the house was asleep, Arthur would sneak in. He would turn that expensive signet ring on his finger, his gray eyes full of exhaustion and regret, and he would whisper apologies in the dark. He would offer her secret promises he was too weak to fulfill in the light. Rosalind's jaw tightened. Her hazel eyes, usually wide and softly tragic, hardened into something unrecognizable. She would not be a secret, and she would not be a victim. She turned and walked swiftly back into the house, bypassing the kitchens entirely, taking the narrow spiral stairs up to her small room in the attic wing. The room was freezing, the small fire in the grate having died hours ago. She pulled a worn leather suitcase from beneath her narrow bed and opened it. She packed with surgical, emotionless precision 3 plain dresses, a pair of sturdy boots, her mother's wedding band, a thick wool coat, the silver key. She took nothing else. On the small wooden vanity sat a velvet box containing a delicate pearl necklace, a private, expensive gift from Arthur. Next to it lay a heavy winter cloak the Dowager had purchased for her as a public display of false charity. Rosalind did not even look at them. She would not take a single thread, a single coin, or a single memory that belonged to the Ashford name. Closing the suitcase, the latch snapped shut with a sharp, final click. She walked back down the stairs and out the servants' exit. The house was entirely absorbed in the Christmas Eve gala. Through the thick stone walls, she could hear the faint, elegant strain of a string quartet playing a waltz. They were dancing. While they danced, Rosalind walked into the blizzard. The trek down the mile-long driveway was grueling. The snow soaked through her thin green dress, chilling her blood, but the cold could not touch the furnace of absolute resolve burning in her chest. By the time she reached the towering, wrought iron gates of Ashford Hall, her hands were numb, and her breath plumed in the freezing air. She stopped. Her hand resting on the freezing iron gate, she turned around to look at the magnificent estate one last time. The massive windows of the grand dining room glowed like warm gold against the pitch black night. He was in there, Arthur, smiling his hollow smiles, protecting his title, convincing himself he had made the only logical choice. Rosalind gripped the silver key in her pocket. The fragile, enduring ward of the Ashford family died on that snow-covered driveway. The woman who turned her back on the glowing mansion and walked out into the freezing dark was entirely someone else. She was going to the financial district. She was going to learn the rules of their game, and then she was going to buy the board. The tarnished silver key slid into the heavy brass lock of Vault 714 with a sharp, satisfying click. It was a rainy Tuesday morning in London, exactly 1 week after Rosalind had walked out of the freezing gates of Ashford Hall. The private bank in the heart of the financial district smelled of old paper, polished mahogany, and the discreet silence of old money. Rosalind stood in the dim light of the vault room, her damp wool coat clinging to her shoulders, her breathing shallow but steady. She turned the key. The heavy metal door swung open. Inside the safety deposit box, there was no mountain of gold, no stacks of crisp banknotes. Instead, there was a single, thick leather folder. Rosalind pulled it out and opened it under the amber light of the bank's reading lamp. Her father had been a merchant, yes, but he had also been a visionary. Before the aristocrats had bled his public companies dry and framed him with forged ledgers, he had quietly funneled his most liquid assets and his most lethal blackmail on the nobility into a blind trust under his mother's maiden name, Storling. There were account books. There were signed promissory notes from desperate lords. And there was a letter written in her father's sharp, hurried handwriting. Rose, if you are reading this, the key has finally served its purpose. I did not leave you an inheritance to live quietly. I left you the leverage to make them pay for the quiet. Learn the market, buy their debts, own the ground they walk on, dice. Rosalind stared at the ink. A strange glacial calm settled over her chest. The fragile, enduring girl who had sat at the servants' table, waiting for a duke to save her, evaporated into the cold London air. She took the tarnished silver key, threaded it onto a delicate, expensive silver chain, and fastened it around her neck. It would rest against her collarbone, a constant, freezing reminder of the night she was cast out. From that day forward, Rosalind Thorne ceased to exist. Over the next 3 years, the London financial district whispered of a new, ruthless entity. Operating entirely through high-level proxies and elite legal firms, a private equity group known only as the Sterling Trust began aggressively acquiring distressed debt. They were surgical, they were quiet, and they were overwhelmingly powerful. Behind the frosted glass of her penthouse office overlooking the Thames, Rosalind transformed. The plain, dark green dresses were discarded. She wore impeccably tailored suits and sharp, minimalist gowns. Her dark brown hair, once pinned simply by her own hands, was now styled with effortless, untouchable elegance. Her wide-set hazel eyes lost their tragic softness, replaced by an assessing, predatory stillness. She learned to speak softly, discovering that when you control millions of pounds, you never have to raise your voice to command a room. She spent 3 years building an empire out of the ashes of her father's ruin, and for 3 years she bought every single piece of debt attached to the Ashford name. 200 miles away, Ashford Hall felt like a magnificent, echoing tomb. Arthur Ashford, the 6th Duke, sat in the vast, roaring silence of his study, staring into the flames of the hearth. A glass of amber whiskey rested untouched on the side table. His thumb rubbed the gold signet ring on his finger in a restless, endless loop. It had been 3 years since she vanished into the snow. He had hired the best private investigators in the country. He had deployed Pinkerton agents to every major port and city. He had spent a small fortune trying to trace a woman with no money, no family, and only the clothes on her back. He had found absolutely nothing. She was a ghost. The guilt was a physical weight in his chest, a slow-acting poison that paralyzed him. Every time he walked into the grand dining room, his eyes involuntarily darted to the far end of the hall, to the exact chair at the secondary table where he had let his mother humiliate the only woman he had ever loved. He remembered the exact shade of her green dress. He remembered the faint mascara tear she had refused to wipe away. He remembered the deafening sound of her wooden chair scraping the floor, and the terrifying straightness of her spine as she walked away from him. He had thought his silence that night was a shield. He had thought he was saving her from the Dowager's forged ledger and the threat of prison. But in the long, sleepless nights that followed, Arthur finally understood the catastrophic arrogance of his choice. He had protected her physical freedom by murdering her dignity. He had treated her like a fragile liability to be managed, rather than a partner to fight beside. Arthur. The sharp, clipped voice of Dowager Duchess Eleanor sliced through his thoughts. Arthur did not turn his head as his mother swept into the study, the heavy emerald silk of her gown rustling against the Persian rug. The Waverley family has formally inquired about your intentions toward their youngest daughter. The Dowager said, standing by his desk with absolute sovereign authority. You are 34. The estate requires an heir, and more importantly, it requires the Waverley dowry. Our liquid capital is temporarily constrained. Arthur finally looked at her. His grey eyes were hollow, exhausted, and lined with a quiet, dangerous resentment. I am not marrying the Waverley girl, mother, he said, his voice flat, and our capital is not temporarily constrained. We are bleeding. The estate has been bleeding for 3 years. The Dowager's jaw tightened. Do not be dramatic. I have secured lines of credit. The Ashford name is flawless. Creditors will always extend terms to a duke. Someone is buying our notes, Arthur countered, picking up a stack of heavy parchment letters from his desk. Every loan, every mortgage on the tenant farms, the primary deed to this very house. They are all being quietly purchased by a single private entity, the Sterling Trust. My solicitors cannot find a face or a name attached to it. They are boxing us in, mother. The Dowager waved her hand dismissively. Financial maneuvers by faceless bankers trying to associate themselves with our prestige. We will host the grand charity auction next month, as planned. We will invite the highest echelons of society. We will project absolute strength, and these little banking annoyances will disappear. You will host it, Arthur, and you will smile. Arthur looked back at the fire. The Dowager still believed she held all the power in the world. She still believed a forged ledger and a cruel smile were enough to rule. He raised his hand, his thumb catching on the edge of his signet ring. I will host your gala, mother, he said quietly, but strength is merely an illusion when someone else owns the floor beneath your feet. The grand charity auction at Ashford Hall was designed to be a blinding spectacle of generational wealth. Exactly 1 month after Arthur's confrontation with his mother in the study, The estate's grand ballroom had been transformed into a glittering theater of excess. Massive arrangements of white winter roses cascaded from tall silver urns. The 3 colossal crystal chandeliers burned with hundreds of candles, casting a flawless, diamond, hard light over the assembled elite of the county. To the untrained eye, the Ashford family was at the absolute zenith of their power. But Arthur Ashford knew the truth. They were a hollow shell, standing on a floor composed entirely of rotting wood. Arthur stood near the towering arched windows, his back rigid beneath his impeccable midnight-tailored evening coat. His deep-set grey eyes surveyed the room, watching the lords, dukes, and foreign investors sip vintage champagne and admire the priceless art placed on display. His thumb moved rhythmically, turning the heavy gold signet ring on his right hand in endless, anxious circles. Every smile he offered, every polite nod he executed, felt like chewing on broken glass. Stop fidgeting with that ring, Arthur. You look like a nervous commoner. Dowager Duchess Eleanor materialized beside him. She was wearing a gown of heavy, blood red velvet tonight, a deliberate choice meant to project predatory dominance. Her icy blue eyes swept the ballroom, calculating the net worth of every guest in attendance. Her angular face, defined by those harsh, unyielding cheekbones, betrayed absolutely no panic. The Waverley family has just arrived. The Dowager murmured, her lips barely moving as she maintained a pleasant, frozen smile for the room. Lord Waverley is inspecting the Renaissance portraits in the East Gallery, and his daughter, Lady Isabella, is speaking with the bishop. You will go to her. You will ask her to dance the opening waltz, and before the auction begins at midnight, you will secure the engagement. Do you understand? Arthur's jaw clenched. You are selling me to cover your debts. Mother, I am securing the survival of this house. She snapped, her voice a razor, thin hiss underneath the polite string quartet playing in the background. The Sterling Trust has escalated their aggressive tactics. Just this morning, they acquired the primary mortgage on our London townhouse. They are circling us, Arthur. They are waiting for us to bleed out. The Waverley Dowry is the only immediate injection of liquid capital that can stave off the foreclosure. Arthur looked away from her, his gaze drifting across the ballroom. By brutal, agonizing coincidence, the main auction stage had been erected at the exact far end of the room where the secondary servants' table used to sit on Christmas Eve, the exact spot where Rosalind Thorne had sat in her plain dark green dress, the exact spot where he had let his mother humiliate her, choosing his cowardly strategy over the woman he loved. He could almost see her ghost standing there. He remembered the faint mascara tear on her pale cheek. He remembered the agonizing silence as she folded her napkin, stood up, and walked away from him. 3 years. 3 years of searching, of deploying Pinkerton agents across the continent, only to find nothing. Arthur. The Dowager's voice was sharp, cutting through his memories like a knife. Look at me. He turned his hollow gray eyes back to his mother. There is no room for your pathetic melancholia tonight. The Dowager commanded, her tone absolute. You are the Duke of Ashford. You will act like one. Go to the Waverley girl. She turned and swept away, a vision in blood red velvet, seamlessly blending back into the crowd of laughing aristocrats to assert her false dominance. Arthur took a slow, shallow breath. The air in the ballroom felt impossibly thin. He stepped forward, intending to fulfill his miserable duty, when his private solicitor, Miss Harding, appeared suddenly from the shadows of the corridor. The older man was pale, his hands trembling slightly as he clutched a sealed legal envelope. Your Grace, Harding whispered, pulling Arthur behind a marble pillar, away from the prying eyes of the guests. What is it, Harding? Arthur asked, his stomach tightening. Has the Waverley patriarch asked for further concessions on the marriage settlement? It is not the Waverleys, Your Grace. Harding said, his voice dropping to a terrified murmur. It is the Sterling Trust. We just received word by courier. They haven't just acquired the London townhouse. Arthur stopped turning his ring. He went entirely still. What have they done? Harding swallowed hard, his eyes wide with sheer panic. They have consolidated every single piece of our debt. The tenant farms, the carriage houses, the ancestral trusts, and the primary deed to Ashford Hall itself. They hold it all. The final grace period expired at sundown today. A cold, paralyzing dread poured through Arthur's veins. Sundown? Why weren't we notified of the final deadline? They deliberately waived the warning notices, Your Grace. They paid the exorbitant legal penalties in cash just to keep the foreclosure silent until tonight. They didn't want to negotiate in a boardroom. They wanted a public execution. Harding looked toward the entrance doors, the representative of the Sterling Trust. "They are here, Your Grace, at the gates. They have come to claim the property." The string quartet hit a high, joyous crescendo. Laughter erupted from a nearby cluster of lords. The brutal irony of it made Arthur dizzy. The Dowager was busy parading the Waverley girl around, drinking expensive champagne, completely unaware that the very floor they were standing on no longer belonged to the Ashford name. Arthur looked toward the grand entrance doors of the ballroom. The heavy oak panels remained shut, guarded by 2 footmen in pristine livery, but beyond them, out in the freezing winter night, the anonymous owner of the Sterling Trust had finally arrived. The house of cards was collapsing, and Arthur realized with a strange, dark sense of relief that he was entirely ready to watch it burn. The news did not explode across the ballroom. In high society, ruin never arrives with a shout. It arrives as a whisper behind a crystal champagne flute, a sudden shift in eye contact, a polite excuse to step away from a conversation. Arthur stood frozen behind the marble pillar, Harding's words echoing in his skull like a death knell. They hold it all. The final grace period expired at sundown today. He looked out at the glittering sea of guests. The string quartet was still playing a lively Viennese waltz, and the hundreds of candles in the chandeliers still burned with brilliant, expensive light. But near the grand entrance, a subtle, devastating shift was occurring. A newly arrived guest, a prominent London banker, had whispered something to the Duke of Somerset. Somerset's eyes widened slightly, and he immediately turned to his wife, guiding her subtly away from the center of the room. The whisper moved like a shadow over the polished floor. It passed from the bankers to the lords, from the lords to the foreign investors. Arthur watched the Earl of Waverley, the man whose daughter, the Dowager, was desperately trying to secure, suddenly stop inspecting a Renaissance painting. A breathless courier had just handed the Earl a small note. Waverley read it, his face draining of color. He looked across the room at Dowager Duchess Eleanor, his expression hardening into one of profound, calculated disgust. He immediately signaled his daughter, Lady Isabella, pulling her away from the dance floor and steering her toward the coat check. The rats were abandoning the sinking ship, and the ship had not even officially gone under yet. "Arthur!" The Dowager's voice was a harsh hiss as she rounded the pillar, her heavy blood, red velvet gown sweeping against the floor. For the first time in his 34 years of life, Arthur saw a genuine fracture in his mother's sovereign composure. Her icy blue eyes were darting frantically across the room, tracking the sudden mass exodus of the most important investors. What is happening? The Dowager demanded, her voice dropping to a furious whisper. Lord Waverley just walked past me without bowing. The French ambassador is leaving before the first course. What have you done? Arthur looked at the woman who had ruled his life, the woman who had forced Rosalind out into the freezing snow with a forged leather ledger. He felt a strange, detached calm wash over his panic. "I have done nothing, mother," Arthur said, his voice completely hollow. "The Sterling Trust has done it all. They did not just buy our debts. They bought the primary deed to Ashford Hall. The grace period expired at sundown. We are no longer the owners of this estate." The Dowager stopped breathing. The color vanished from her sharp, angular face, leaving her high cheekbones looking like exposed bone. "That is impossible. That is a lie. I have the ledgers, I have the connections. You have nothing." Arthur cut her off, his tone flat and unyielding. "They bypassed your connections. They paid the legal penalties in cash just to execute the foreclosure tonight, right now, in front of the entire county. It is not a negotiation, mother. It is an execution." "No." The Dowager snapped, her hands trembling as she smoothed the front of her velvet gown, desperately trying to rebuild her crumbling reality. "No faceless banking entity dares to humiliate a duke in his own home. I will speak to them. I will offer them the Waverley dowry as collateral." "Waverley is leaving, mother," Arthur pointed out coldly. "Everyone is leaving, or rather, they are staying just long enough to watch us fall." The ambient noise in the ballroom had changed. The light, polite laughter was gone, replaced by a low, synchronized murmur of anticipation. 200 members of the elite had stopped dancing. They were all standing at the edges of the room, their eyes fixed intently on the grand oak doors at the entrance of the ballroom. They knew the Sterling Trust had come to collect, and high society lived for the spectacle of a fallen titan. Outside the massive, arched windows, the sound of heavy carriage wheels crunched against the snow covered gravel of the main drive. It was not the clatter of a standard rented carriage. It was the deep, rhythmic, heavy sound of an armored bank coach. The carriage stopped. The silence inside the ballroom became absolute. Even the string quartet, sensing the suffocating tension in the air, faltered and stopped playing. The final note of the cello, groaning out into the quiet. Arthur's heart slammed against his ribs. He felt cold sweat prickle at the back of his neck. He stepped out from behind the pillar, walking slowly toward the center of the room. The Dowager followed a step behind him, her posture rigid, her chin lifted in a pathetic, terrifying display of a queen refusing to acknowledge that her crown had already been stripped away. At the grand entrance, the two senior footmen stood paralyzed, their white, gloved hands resting on the brass handles of the heavy oak doors. They looked toward Arthur, their eyes wide with uncertainty, silently asking for permission to open them. Footsteps echoed from the marble foyer outside, slow, deliberate. The sharp, unmistakable click of expensive heels striking the stone floor. It was not a team of aggressive corporate lawyers. It was a single person. Open the doors, Arthur commanded, his voice echoing in the dead silence of the ballroom. The footman pulled the heavy oak panels inward. A gust of freezing winter air swept into the overheated ballroom, making the flames of the hundreds of candles flicker and dance wildly, casting long, erratic shadows across the faces of the frozen elite. The representative of the Sterling Trust had arrived. The freezing gust of winter wind whipped through the grand ballroom, carrying with it the sharp scent of snow and pine. The flames of the hundreds of candles in the crystal chandeliers danced violently, casting long, erratic shadows across the frozen faces of the county's elite. Every eye in the room was locked onto the heavy oak doors. From the shadows of the marble foyer, a figure stepped into the blinding diamond hard light. The rhythmic, authoritative click of her heels against the stone floor echoed in the dead silence. The crowd of aristocrats, bankers, and foreign investors instinctively parted, stepping back to create a wide, clear path. They did not know her face, but high society possessed a primal instinct for recognizing absolute power. And the woman walking into the ballroom radiated a cold, lethal dominance that suffocated the room. She wore a gown of heavy midnight blue velvet. It was a masterpiece of sharp, minimalist tailoring, devoid of the excessive lace and ruffled embellishments that the other women in the room wore. The dark, rich fabric absorbed the light, making her look like a piece of the winter night sky brought indoors. Her dark brown hair, once pinned simply by her own trembling hands, was styled in an effortless, elegant sweep that exposed the long, graceful line of her neck. But it was her eyes that truly arrested the room, the wide, set hazel eyes that had once been soft, tragic, and full of silent endurance were now entirely unrecognizable. They were glacial. They moved over the glittering crowd with the assessing, detached precision of a predator cataloging its prey, and resting against her collarbone, suspended on a delicate, unimaginably expensive chain of platinum and diamonds, was a tarnished, old silver key. Arthur Ashford forgot how to breathe. He stood frozen near the center of the ballroom, his hands dropping numbly to his sides. The heavy gold signet ring on his finger suddenly felt like a shackle pulling him toward the floor. The blood roared in his ears, drowning out the ambient noise of the wind. Of Rose. His mind screamed the name, but his throat was paralyzed. It was her. It was Rosalind Thorne. But the fragile, enduring girl who had sat at the servants' table in a plain green dress 3 years ago was dead. The woman walking toward him was a ghost forged in ice and iron. He stared at her, profound agony and terror warring in his chest. For 3 years, he had convinced himself that his silence had saved her. He had justified his cowardice by believing she was too weak to survive the Dowager's wrath. But looking at her now, moving with the terrifying composure of a queen inspecting her conquered territory, Arthur realized the devastating truth. He hadn't saved her from the fire. She had walked into the fire, let it burn away her fear, and brought the flames. Who is she? The Duke of Somerset whispered loudly to his wife, eyes that the representative of the trust. Lady Peaton murmured, her fan fluttering nervously. She looks entirely too young to manage such capital. Dowager Duchess Eleanor stepped forward, her heavy blood, red velvet gown sweeping the floor. Her icy blue eyes narrowed as she studied the approaching woman. The Dowager's arrogance was still intact. She was completely blinded by her own superiority. She saw the midnight blue gown. She saw the undeniable wealth, but her brain refused to connect this untouchable sovereign with the orphaned ward she had banished to the kitchen. Rosalind stopped 10 feet away from Arthur and the Dowager. She did not bow. She did not curtsy. She simply stood there, a vertical line of dark velvet and quiet authority, and let the silence stretch until it became agonizing. Arthur's eyes desperately searched hers. He was silently begging for a flicker of recognition, a microscopic sign of the love she had once held for him. But looking into Rosalind's hazel eyes was like looking at the smooth surface of a frozen lake. There was absolutely nothing there for him. He was no longer the center of her universe. He was just a man standing on a floor he no longer owned. The Dowager lifted her chin, projecting the false, sovereign dominance she had used to rule Ashford Hall for decades. "I assume you are the senior representative dispatched by the Sterling Trust," the Dowager said, her voice carrying across the silent ballroom. Her tone was sharp, dripping with condescension. "It is highly unorthodox and frankly entirely lacking in basic etiquette for a banking institution to disrupt a private charity gala. However, since you are here, you may present your terms to my solicitors in the morning. We will restructure the debt." Rosalind looked at the older woman. She did not flinch. She did not shrink back. The faint, subtle shadow of a smile touched the corner of her lips, a smile so cold it made the hair on the back of Arthur's neck stand up. When Rosalind finally spoke, she did not raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her tone was soft, melodic, and devastatingly steady, slicing through the heavy air of the ballroom. "I am not a representative of the trust," Rosalind said quietly, "and there will be no restructuring in the morning." The Dowager frowned, a flicker of genuine confusion finally cracking her angular face. "If you are not the representative, then who exactly are you to dictate terms in my house?" Rosalind took one slow, deliberate step forward. The tarnished silver key caught the chandelier light, a brutal reminder of the past. "I am the sole owner of the Sterling Trust, Eleanor," Rosalind said, dropping the Dowager's formal title with surgical disrespect. "And as of sundown today, this is no longer your house." The words hung in the freezing air of the ballroom, sharper than the winter wind, whipping through the open oak doors. "This is no longer your house." For a long, agonizing moment, Dowager Duchess Eleanor simply stared at the woman in the midnight blue velvet gown. The Dowager's brain, conditioned by decades of absolute aristocratic supremacy, actively rejected the information. Her icy blue eyes widened, and the harsh, angular lines of her face twitched. "You are insane," the Dowager hissed, stepping closer to Rosalind, her heavy blood, red velvet dress brushing against the polished marble floor. She kept her voice low, a desperate, venomous whisper meant only for Rosalind and Arthur, terrified that the surrounding elite would hear. "You are Rosalind Thorne, a ruined merchant's orphan stray. You do not own the Sterling Trust. You do not own anything. You left this house with nothing but the clothes on your back." Rosalind did not blink. She stood perfectly still, the diamond chain around her neck catching the fractured light of the crystal chandeliers, illuminating the tarnished silver key resting against her collarbone. "I left with exactly what I needed, Eleanor," Rosalind replied, her voice smooth and devoid of any emotional tremor. "An understanding of how your game is played, and the capital to buy the board." Arthur stood paralyzed beside his mother. His deep-set gray eyes were locked on Rosalind's face. He remembered the fragile, trembling girl he had abandoned to the wolves 3 years ago. He had spent 1,000 sleepless nights hating himself for his cowardice, convincing himself that he had sacrificed her dignity to save her from a prison cell. But the woman standing before him needed no savior. She was a Leviathan. The Dowager's chest heaved. Panic, raw and unrefined, finally began to bleed through her sovereign facade. She realized with a sickening drop in her stomach that the elite guests surrounding them had fallen dead silent. They were watching. They were listening. Desperate to regain control, the Dowager resorted to the only weapon she had ever successfully wielded against this girl. "If this is some elaborate, pathetic bluff to embarrass us, it ends now." The Dowager snarled, her manicured fingers trembling slightly as she pointed a finger at Rosalind. "Have you forgotten the black leather ledger? Rosalind, have you forgotten the evidence of your father's treason? I still possess it. It is locked in my private safe upstairs. If you do not turn around and walk out of those doors immediately, I will hand it to the Crown Magistrate tonight. You will spend the next 20 years rotting in a frozen cell." Arthur's heart stopped. "Mother, enough!" he rasped, stepping forward, his hands clenching into fists. The heavy gold signet ring on his finger bit into his own skin. He had let that ledger dictate his actions once. He would not do it again. But Rosalind simply raised an elegant, gloved hand, silencing a duke with a single, effortless motion. She did not even look at him. Her glacial hazel eyes remained locked onto the Dowager. And then Rosalind Thorne smiled. It was not a smile of joy. It was a slow, chilling curve of the lips, the smile of a predator watching its prey step willingly into a steel trap. The black leather ledger, Rosalind mused, her voice echoing softly in the quiet room. A masterful piece of forgery, Eleanor. I will admit it terrified me when I was 26. But you have fundamentally misunderstood the nature of power. Rosalind took one slow step forward, forcing the Dowager to take a frantic step back. You think a forged book of accounts matters to the Crown Magistrate now? Rosalind asked, her tone dropping to a devastating, conversational murmur. Eleanor, who do you think owns the magistrate's gambling debts? Who do you think holds the mortgage on the judge's private estate? Who do you think finances the very court you plan to drag me into? The color entirely drained from the Dowager's face, leaving her looking like a bloodless corpse draped in red velvet. The ledger is dead, Rosalind stated, her words striking like physical blows. It is a worthless pile of rotting paper. It only had power when I was poor, and you were rich. But you are not rich anymore, Eleanor. You are bankrupt. And I am the one holding the leash. From the shadows of the foyer behind Rosalind, a tall, silent man in a dark suit stepped forward. It was Mr. Aldridge, the senior partner of London's most ruthless legal firm. He handed Rosalind a sleek black leather folder. Rosalind opened the folder with steady, deliberate hands. The same hands that had once gripped a silver key in terrified agony were now operating with surgical calm. She pulled out a thick, heavy parchment document bearing the glowing red wax seal of the Royal Bank. This, Rosalind said, holding the document up so the candlelight illuminated the dense legal text, is the master deed to Ashford Hall. I hold the deed to the tenant farms. I hold the deed to the carriage houses. I hold the deed to the ground you are currently standing on. Arthur stopped breathing. He stared at the parchment, the ultimate, undeniable proof of his family's absolute ruin. The estate that had borne the Ashford name for 100 years had been wiped out by the woman he had sent to the servants' table. You cannot do this, the Dowager whispered, her voice finally breaking into a pathetic, ragged gasp. Her knees trembled, and she swayed slightly, the heavy emerald necklace around her throat suddenly looking like a noose. We are dukes. We are the Ashfords. You were the Ashfords, Rosalind corrected coldly. She turned her gaze away from the broken older woman and finally looked at Arthur. Arthur's grey eyes met hers. He saw the cold, untouchable elegance in her posture. He saw the complete absence of love, of pity, of anything that belonged to their past. And as the legal owner of this property, Rosalind said, her voice rising just enough to carry to the hundreds of silent, listening aristocrats in the ballroom, I am officially canceling this auction. The phrase echoed through the cavernous ballroom, sharp and cold as the winter wind. If I am officially canceling this auction. A collective gasp rippled through the 200 elite guests. The string quartet remained frozen, their bows resting uselessly against their instruments. The diamond, hard light of the crystal chandeliers illuminated the sudden, terrifying shift in the room's hierarchy. High society was a vicious ecosystem built entirely on the perception of power, and in a matter of seconds, they had just watched the undisputed Queen of the County be stripped of her crown by a ghost in midnight blue velvet. Dowager Duchess Eleanor's knees finally gave out. She did not fall entirely to the floor, but she stumbled heavily, her manicured hand shooting out to grip the edge of a nearby marble display table. The heavy blood, red velvet of her gown, meant to project predatory dominance, now looked like a heavy, suffocating shroud. She gasped for air, her icy blue eyes wide and unfocused, staring at the Royal Bank's master deed in Rosalind's gloved hand. You cannot. The Dowager wheezed, the sovereign authority completely stripped from her voice, leaving only the pathetic tremor of a cornered animal. She looked wildly toward the crowd. Somerset! Lord Waverley! You cannot allow this. This usurper to insult us? Arrest her! Someone call the magistrate! No one moved. Lord Waverley, the man whose daughter the Dowager had desperately tried to buy just an hour ago, simply adjusted his evening coat, looked at the Dowager with profound, freezing indifference, and took a deliberate step backward. The Duke of Somerset followed suit. The foreign investors whispered among themselves, their eyes locked on Rosalind with newfound predatory respect. In the financial district, money did not just talk. It silenced the room, and Rosalind Thorne currently owned the room. Without sparing another glance at the hyperventilating dowager, Rosalind walked forward. Her heels clicked rhythmically against the polished floor. The crowd parted seamlessly, giving her a wide berth as she moved toward the far end of the ballroom, toward the elevated stage that had been built for the charity auction. Arthur Ashford watched her walk. His deep-set grey eyes traced the elegant, untouchable line of her posture. His heart slammed painfully against his ribs. He realized exactly where she was heading. By some brutal, poetic twist of fate, the auction stage had been erected on the exact spot where the secondary servants' table had stood 3 years ago. The exact spot where she had sat in her plain dark green dress, holding her tears back while the room laughed at her. Rosalind ascended the short velvet steps to the stage. She turned slowly, the midnight blue gown sweeping gracefully around her ankles. The tarnished silver key on her diamond chain rested coolly against her collarbone. She looked down at the glittering sea of aristocrats, bankers, and lords. She looked at Arthur. And finally she looked at the dowager, who was clinging to the marble table for support. 3 years ago, on Christmas Eve, I sat in this exact corner of the room. Rosalind began, her voice melodic, perfectly modulated, and devastatingly clear. She did not need to shout. The absolute silence of the ballroom amplified her every word. I was placed here by Dowager Duchess Eleanor, seated below the kitchen staff, because she believed my dignity was the cheapest currency in Ashford Hall. A low murmur swept through the crowd. Several guests who had been present that night shifted uncomfortably, suddenly realizing the identity of the woman standing above them. She held a forged ledger over my head, threatening to frame my late father for treason if I dared to defend myself. Rosalind continued, her hazel eyes glacial and unyielding, and she did it because she believed that, without a title, without an aristocratic name, I was entirely powerless. She believed I would break. Rosalind placed the heavy parchment deed onto the wooden auction podium. The sound of the thick paper hitting the wood was like a gavel striking a block. But I did not break, Rosalind stated softly, the ice in her tone making the air in the room drop another 10 degrees. I walked out into the snow. I took the capital my father left me, and I went to the financial district. For 3 years, while the Ashford family hosted galas and drank vintage champagne, I bought their debts. I bought the mortgages on their tenant farms. I bought the loans financing this very ballroom. I bought the ground you are all currently standing on. The dowager let out a stifled, agonizing sob. She pressed her hand over her mouth, her high cheekbones pale and hollow, her entire aristocratic reality collapsing around her. The social execution was absolute. The Ashford name, once the most feared and respected in the county, was now synonymous with bankruptcy, forgery, and ruin. The Ashford estate is hopelessly insolvent, Rosalind announced to the room, her gaze sweeping over the investors and bankers. There will be no Waverley dowry to save them. There will be no restructuring. The Sterling Trust has officially foreclosed on Ashford Hall. Rosalind looked down at Mrs. Harding, the Ashford family's terrified solicitor, who was trembling near the edge of the stage. She picked up a second document from the black leather folder and handed it down to him. Harding. Rosalind said, her voice dropping to a quiet, lethal command. You will serve the Dowager Duchess with her formal eviction notice. She has exactly 48 hours to pack her personal belongings and vacate my property. If she takes a single silver spoon that belongs to the estate, I will have her arrested for theft. The solicitor took the paper with shaking hands, bowing his head in complete submission to the new sovereign. Rosalind finally turned her gaze to Arthur. He was standing alone in the center of the room, his black evening coat stark against the pale marble floor, the man who had chosen strategy over her, the man who had let her burn. And as for the Duke, Rosalind said softly, her eyes locking onto his. And as for the Duke. Rosalind's words floated through the cavernous ballroom, soft but carrying the lethal weight of a blade. The 200 members of the county's elite held their collective breath. The diamond hard light of the crystal chandeliers beat down on the marble floor, illuminating the stark contrast between the two figures. Rosalind stood on the auction stage, an untouchable sovereign draped in midnight, blue velvet. Arthur Ashford stood below her, a man whose ancestral empire had just been reduced to ash. Arthur did not look away. His deep, set grey eyes were completely unguarded, stripped of the expensive, aristocratic confidence he had worn for 34 years. He stepped forward, moving away from his weeping mother, until he was standing at the very edge of the velvet steps. Leading up to the podium, he looked up at Rosalind. He saw the tarnished silver key resting against her collarbone, suspended by diamonds. He saw the glacial, terrifying calm in her wide, set hazel eyes. "I am not going to contest the deed, Rosalind," Arthur said. His voice was hoarse, but it carried clearly across the silent room. He did not use her formal title, nor did he address her as a creditor. He spoke to her as the woman he had lost. "The estate is yours. You earned it in the dark while we paraded in the light. But before I leave this house tonight, there is something this room needs to hear." Arthur turned his head slightly, his gaze sweeping over the staring faces of the lords, bankers and foreign investors. He was intentionally drawing their judgment away from the foreclosed property and centering it entirely on his own sins. It was the first truly brave thing he had done in 3 years. 3 years ago, on Christmas Eve, I sat at the center of this room. Arthur began, his voice steadying into a painful, resonant confession. I watched the woman I loved be banished to the servants' table. I watched my mother mock her, and I said absolutely nothing. I pretended I did not know her. A few shocked whispers broke out among the crowd. The Duke of Somerset frowned, leaning in to listen. Arthur turned back to Rosalind, his hands dropping entirely to his sides, defenseless. "I want you to know why. 3 hours before that dinner, my mother placed a black leather ledger on my desk. It contained masterfully forged evidence that would have convicted your late father of treason. She told me that if I looked at you, if I defended you, if I showed you an ounce of mercy at that table, she would hand the ledger to the magistrate. You would have been sentenced to 20 years in a frozen, miserable prison cell." The Dowager let out a sharp, ragged gasp from her place near the marble table, horrified that her son was airing her criminal blackmail in front of the entire county, but Arthur ignored her. "I thought I was saving your life," Arthur said, his voice cracking slightly, the heavy gold signet ring on his finger suddenly feeling like a lead weight. "I thought my silence was a shield. I looked at the faint mascara tear on your cheek, and it tore my soul apart. But I believed I was making the only logical choice to keep you safe. I thought I was protecting you." The ballroom was dead silent. The elite guests stared at Arthur, realizing they were witnessing a man completely dismantle his own soul in public. Rosalind looked down at him. Her posture did not shift. Her red lipstick remained immaculate, completely untouched by tears. She did not gasp. She did not soften. "I know, Arthur," Rosalind said quietly. Arthur froze. The blood drained entirely from his face. You knew." "Of course I knew," Rosalind replied, her voice a smooth, icy current. "I knew what was in your mother's vault. My father warned me before he died, when you looked right through me at that dinner table. I didn't leave because I misunderstood your strategy. I left because I understood it perfectly." Arthur stared at her, profound agony washing over his features as the devastating truth finally settled into his bones. "You chose my physical survival over my honor," Rosalind continued, her tone relentless and elegant. "You looked at me and saw a fragile, helpless ward who needed to be managed, who needed a duke to fall on his sword in secret while she suffered in public. You didn't trust my strength. You didn't trust me to fight beside you. Practicality without honor is just a different breed of cruelty. Arthur, you kept me out of a physical prison, but you built me a social one, and I refused to be a victim to be managed." The words struck Arthur like physical blows. He closed his eyes for a fraction of a second. The suffocating guilt he had carried for 3 years suddenly morphed into a blinding, agonizing clarity. She hadn't needed a savior. She had needed a partner, and he had failed her. Arthur opened his eyes. He did not try to preserve his pride. He did not try to salvage the Ashford dignity. In front of the wealthiest and most powerful families in the county, Arthur Ashford bowed his head. "You are right," Arthur said, his voice thick with a raw, undeniable grief. "I was a coward dressed up as a responsible man. I underestimated your brilliance, your resilience, and your pride. I let them strip you of your dignity, and for that there is no excuse. I am profoundly, entirely sorry, Rosalind, not for losing this estate, but for losing you." The room that had once laughed at her now stood in paralyzed, breathless silence, watching a duke publicly beg for forgiveness from the woman he had cast out. Rosalind Thorne stood under the diamond hard light of the chandelier. Her spine was perfectly straight. She looked at the man who had broken her heart, the man who had just stripped his own soul bare for her, in front of the world. She did not shed a single tear. The grand ballroom of Ashford Hall was so quiet that the sound of the winter wind howling against the arched glass windows felt deafening. 200 members of the county's elite stood frozen, the diamond hard light of the chandeliers beating down on them. They had come tonight to celebrate a dynasty. Instead, they were witnessing its absolute, undeniable surrender. Arthur Ashford, the man who had been raised to rule this county, kept his head bowed before the woman in midnight, blue velvet. He offered no excuses. He asked for no unearned mercy. He simply stood in the wreckage of his ancestral empire and offered her the one thing he had been too cowardly to give her 3 years ago, the truth. Rosalind Thorne looked down at him from the auction stage. The tarnished silver key rested coolly against her collarbone, suspended by its heavy diamond chain. Her red lipstick remained entirely immaculate, completely untouched by tears. 3 years ago, standing in the freezing snow outside the kitchen doors, she would have given everything she possessed to hear Arthur say those words. She would have traded her father's key for his protection. But the fragile girl who had wanted to be saved was dead, and Rosalind had no intention of resurrecting her. An apology does not rewrite history, Arthur, Rosalind said, her voice smooth, low, and echoing with devastating calm. It merely acknowledges the damage. 3 years ago, I needed a partner. You chose to be a politician. You broke my heart to protect my physical freedom, and in doing so, you taught me that the only person I could ever truly rely on was myself. Arthur closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, absorbing the agonizing justice of her words. I know. He rasped, his voice thick with grief. And I will not insult you by asking you to forget it. You have won, Rosalind, completely and absolutely. I will ensure my mother is packed and gone within the 48 hours you have mandated. He turned slowly, preparing to walk away from the stage, away from the glittering ballroom, and away from the only home he had ever known. I issued an eviction notice for Dowager Duchess Eleanor. Rosalind's voice cut through the air, sharp and precise, stopping him dead in his tracks. I did not issue one for you. Arthur froze. He turned back to face her, his deep, set gray eyes wide with a sudden, confusing shock. The surrounding aristocrats leaned in, completely captivated by the shifting power dynamic. Rosalind stepped down from the podium, her midnight blue velvet gown sweeping elegantly across the wooden stage. She stopped at the edge of the velvet steps, looking down at Arthur with the assessing, untouchable authority of a sovereign. The Sterling Trust now owns 2,000 acres of tenant farms, 4 carriage houses, and this primary estate, Rosalind stated, her tone entirely professional, stripped of any cheap, romantic melodrama. I am a businesswoman, Arthur. I do not let valuable assets rot for the sake of petty vengeance. This estate requires a manager, someone who knows the soil, who knows the ledgers, and who understands the architecture of this house better than any hired agent from London. Arthur stared at her, his breath catching in his throat. You will not be the Duke of Ashford within these walls. Rosalind continued, her hazel eyes locking onto his with glacial intensity. You will not host galas. You will not sit at the head of the main dining table. If you stay, you will stay as an employee of the Sterling Trust. You will answer to my board. You will answer to my solicitors. And above all, Arthur, you will answer to me. The terms were brutal. For a man born to the highest echelons of the British aristocracy, being reduced to a salaried employee in his own ancestral home was a degradation most lords would rather die than accept. The Duke of Somerset gasped audibly from the crowd, but Arthur did not gasp. He looked up at the woman who had conquered his world, and for the first time all evening, the suffocating weight in his chest began to lift. She was not offering him a fairy tale romance. She was offering him a crucible. She was giving him the chance to rebuild his honor from the dirt up, standing in the exact place where he had thrown hers away. Slowly, deliberately, Arthur reached down to his right hand. He gripped the heavy gold signet ring, the symbol of the Ashford generational wealth, the ring he had nervously turned on his finger for 3 agonizing years, and he pulled it off. He walked up the velvet steps. He did not touch her. He did not dare. Instead, he placed the heavy gold ring onto the wooden podium right next to the Royal Bank's master deed. It was a complete physical surrender of his title, his ego, and his past. I accept your terms, Miss Thorne, Arthur said, his voice steady, stripped of its aristocratic arrogance and filled with a quiet, grounded resolve. I will manage your estate. I will earn my keep, and I will spend the rest of my life learning how to stand beside you rather than trying to manage you. Rosalind looked at the gold ring resting beside her deed. She did not smile, but the icy, predatory tension in her shoulders softened by a fraction of a millimeter. It was not forgiveness, but it was a beginning. Without another word, Rosalind turned her gaze to the 200 elite guests who were still standing in paralyzed silence on her marble floor. "The auction is cancelled," Rosalind announced, her voice echoing with absolute, unquestionable sovereignty. "You may all show yourselves out of my house." Nobody argued, nobody whispered. Lord Waverley bowed his head respectfully to Rosalind, completely ignoring the weeping dowager, and walked toward the coat check. The Duke of Somerset followed. One by one, the wealthiest and most powerful families in the county turned their backs on the Ashford name and bowed to the ghost in midnight. Blue velvet. The heavy oak doors opened, letting the freezing winter wind sweep the remaining warmth from the room as the guests filed out into the snow. Rosalind Thorne stood alone at the center of the stage. She raised her gloved hand, her fingertips lightly brushing against the tarnished silver key, resting over her heart. The grand dining room where she had once been banished to the servants' table now belonged entirely to her. She had not waited for the fire to burn her down. She had walked into the flames, learned the rules, and bought the ashes. And as the crystal chandeliers flickered above her, casting diamonds of light across her dark gown, she knew, with absolute certainty, that she would never be seated in the shadows again.